welcome everybody. I'm Corby Kummer from The Atlantic, but significantly today from Atlanta Magazine and Boston Magazine, where I am restaurant critics. And I was just telling Adam that I had to take the train from Boston to scenic Bridgeport to get here rather than driving from Boston because I was on deadline for a restaurant review.
You didn't tell me that. You told me that you were going there.
Just getting to it. We have deadlines in this business, and they're not always the pleasantest things to meet.
No.
But I have to write 2 of these a month, and Adam has to write
2.5.
2.5.
You got a harder job than me. Yeah, I could write two. Well, I used in the olden days. I worked for New York Magazine. You're a veteran of the city. Corby also was once the critic for New York Magazine also. So if you want to talk about a restaurant critic, here's a very well-known restaurant critic. So anyway, New York Magazine, and it used to be mostly weekly. It's the magazine itself has become bi-weekly, but the website is, every 5 minutes. So it's this dichotomy. So I will write the classic reviews I will do for the magazine, but they will go online. And then I'll do a whole assortment of stuff for the website, which is this great white shark maw of content that you just have to keep feeding, like feeding.
But that amounts to more than 2.5 if you're doing 2 full dress pieces.
Well, those are reviews.
Right.
So those are like old-fashioned reviews. The weird thing about, and I don't know if you have this also, reviews in the classic sense, the sense that I started writing restaurant reviews for New York 15 years ago. And you write them in this discursive way. All critics, I think, write them differently. But what you try to do, what I try to do, is to you sort of set the scene and sort of trying to find some issue, and then you sort of bring people through the pleasures of the meal, because many of them will not actually go there. So you try and create the pleasures of the meal, and then you sort of come to some conclusion. So that's how I write for the magazine, but online it's a different thing, and I really quite haven't figured it out. I mean, online people like lists, they like little bites, they like the diner today. Tell me if this is true or not. Really likes to make the decisions themselves, so they like to know what's being served and like what the place looks like, but they don't necessarily want to be told all the time whether it's good or bad. So in New York, we have a lot of that. There's a lot of like openings, and here's the food, and here's the stuff, and here's the food. And every couple of weeks, I put on my critic mantle and make a pronouncement.
What used to be the case was that critics could be tastemakers. And one of the reasons New York Magazine came into existence was it was its own weather field and heat force map. It determined what was hot. Right. Clay Felker, the original editor, kept his ear to the ground and said, this is what's hot. But if you read it in New York Magazine, it was trendy and you would go. And now, New York Magazine has to keep up with the trends as well as ratifying them.
Well, yeah. But also, I mean, we sort of want to tell you what's hot. But it's a much more chaotic, bigger playing field. So, we can talk about this, but a lot of different things have happened since I took this job 15 years ago. The first thing that's happened is that the business that we're a part of, the print business, has dissipated and changed in a huge way. So the economics of the job are different because it's very expensive to have a restaurant critic. You're spending, especially in New York, you're spending huge amounts of money. You're often going to restaurants several times which you don't review. And so that's changed. I think in New York now, there's, as far as sort of working old-fashioned restaurant critics, there may be 3 or 4.
There's like 3.
Yeah, it's me, Pete Wells for the Times, and a man named Ryan Sutton who works for Eater, who works for a website. And the other places have different arrangements, but they're not the sort of steady, moneyed critic that we grew up with.
And this is shocking. I mean, this is
sort of shocking.
This is a change.
Yeah, but also the other thing that's happened is you have a new generation of eater. Now, there have been various generations of eaters. You've had the the boiled potato generation, you've had the Stouffer's generation, you've had the TV dinner generation, you have the sort of fast food McDonald's generation, which is really me. And then the latest generation I would call the Starbucks generation, right? And this is the generation, Starbucks is a full service, quite technical, coddle you a lot. There's a lot of talk about beans, and Starbucks is a very actually sophisticated restaurant. The kids who go to Starbucks, who grow up going to Starbucks, have quite sophisticated tastes. And unlike their parents who went to restaurants and were used to being told, A, what restaurant to go to, and B, when they got to that restaurant, were used to being told what to eat by officious-looking characters dressed up like, in their tuxedos, speaking foreign accents, and oh, this is Italian, it must be good, this is French, it must be good, this is whatever, it must be good. Their kids are like, no. Their kids are, let me decide what's good. I have a knowledge of where the good pork comes from. With the internet now, they have knowledge. Basically they can know, the entire history of dining and food is at their fingertips. So they have a knowledge of all this kind of stuff. So that's happened. You have this different generation of eater, more sophisticated, less willing to put up with the frippery, the sort of frippery of what we used to call fine dining, which really doesn't exist very much anymore. And then you've had, in the last 15, 20 years, you've had this revolution in the kitchen, and I'm sure Corby could talk about it a lot. And I've written about it, you've written about it, it's been described in various ways. The way I would describe it is it's sort of what's happened in the dining culture is that the culture of the kitchen, which used to be kept behind closed doors, you wouldn't see the chef, you would hear mutterings and screamings, but you wouldn't see it. The dining room was a very stately place, very stagey. If you saw you saw the restaurateur or the maitre d' who would sort of usher you in, and then this really quite operatic play would unfold, classically. That's all flipped around. So now these days, the classic, the trendy restaurants in New York and therefore the world, the kitchen culture is now front and center. You have open kitchens. You have the music that the chefs used to play in the kitchen while they were getting stoned and making their pasta. It's now like blasted out over the landscape.
Yeah, we all know how softly and discreetly music plays.
Well, this all happened, right? It's like, Mario Batali, who's a restaurant Babbo, Batali started a lot of this stuff, and then was imitated. But Babbo, if you know, you've been to Babbo, is an Italian restaurant in the Village. First of all, very, very hefty, rustic. He likes to say that it's really Italian. It is somewhat Italian, but it's also the stuff that he likes to eat. It's like the stuff that chefs like to eat. Chefs like pork. People in the kitchen like pork. That's why we're all eating pork now, essentially. So that's how that happened. They like burgers. They like ramen. They like all the stuff that you now are sort of slavishly going around making lists of, and I'm making top 10 lists of. It's what the chefs classically would share amongst themselves after service. And Batali was one of the first, but Batali basically said, I'm a cook, I'm going to, give them the food I like, and I'm going to create the atmosphere that I enjoy. And it became more and more. David Chang, people who looked at Batali and had been, all of them trained in very fancy kitchens, came along and basically said, I'm going to make the food that I want to make for myself, and if people like it, fine. And everybody loved it. So that's happened, and so that sort of, took it was really sort of I've called it the kitchen slave revolution. It sort of turned the old fine dining world on its head. And so you have less and less of the restaurants like the ones that we grew up worshiping, like Le Bernardin, like the old French ones all closed, but they're still grand restaurants in New York. But they're not making many new ones. They'll come along once, we can talk about this, but once every 4 or 5 years, a ambitious, quote-unquote, fine dining restaurant will open. But generally, the restaurants that open are along the Batali Chang model, which is chefs cooking what either they've grown up eating, which could be outsized versions of the old Italian deli neighborhood in Staten Island or whatever. If you've heard of restaurants called Carbone, you've heard of
Everyone's
the
heard the Carbone restaurant and Teresi Brothers, and they are taking over the Sacred Four Seasons.
Right. So they follow the Chang model. They're not going around saying I'm following the Chang model. It's just like they're like, okay, those guys started out serving first-class chicken parm sandwiches at a little space in the village, and took it from there. So anyway, so you have that. You have this sort of revolution in the dining world, and you have the dissipation of our old print world. And then you have the internet, which has created this giant appetite for information. And so you have this giant appetite for hype, not just in all sorts of fields, but especially in food. And the foodies love to know where to go and what to talk about. And I've been here, I was there, you have to go. If you didn't, you're an idiot. They don't say that, but it's all implied. You're an idiot. Much. He knows all about this because you've been in a long time. Oh, yeah, oh. And there's this just wind in that space, this endless wind, and the internet is obviously, the web has created this this hurricane of what's new, what's good, what's blah, 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 blah. Ironically, while really there's nothing new, it's not that new or that good. I mean, it's good, but it's not this world where an opera critic Anton Ego critic, the one in the great movie Ratatouille, who's sort of the great archetype for what used to be the restaurant critic. There's not, it's not a world where this character can come and sort of quietly survey the landscape and make his judgments and have people listen to it. It's a much more chaotic environment now.
So do you feel that you are sort of being forced to follow this windy internet crowd if you're making lists of the top 10 ramen?
Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, lists. I mean, come on. I mean, I like lists. Lists are good, but lists are also. Anybody who's reviewed, been a restaurant critic, will tell you that of the critical disciplines, quote unquote, it's by far the most subjective. How you perceive a meal at a restaurant depends on all sorts of things. There are your own tastes. There's when you go there, because it changes. The experience will change not just day by day, but minute by minute. There's whether the chef is feeling good that day or is even in the kitchen, and which is classically why the Anton Ego / Craig Claiborne / New York Times / Michelin critic will go many times, classically. But even then, you'll go many times, and I used to go 3, now I go 2. I don't know how many times you go. 3. Congratulations. You make.
But I cover fewer than you do.
Okay. But you make a judgment, and you're really making an argument. And this is true of any. This is true of a book critic. It's true of a movie critic. But book critics and movie critics are reading the same book and they're seeing the same movie. But restaurant critics are not doing that. So it's a very subjective thing. And as a critic, I try just to be consistent. Somebody who's reading me will know my tastes. My tastes are probably quite. I'm sort of more matter of fact. There are some critics who are. I remember Frank Bruni was like an Italian food, lunatic, or thought he was. So he would write very highfalutin about Italian food. So critics all have tastes and styles.
But they also have pockets of expertise. When Ruth Reichel was there, she'd come from Los Angeles, so she knew Asian food, and she suddenly had to be the New York expert on Japan and the Pacific Rim because that was her experience.
Right. And also she's worked for the New York Times, so that conveyed basically godlike stature on her. And I think she said. I say this as a New York Magazine critic who's been writing against Times critics my whole life. So, it's true. And Ruth's a great critic. And there tends to be various kinds of critics, and there are critics who will focus on the plate. They're very focused on the plate, very sort of obsessively focused on what's going on the plate. Sort of type A, many of them tend to be sort of type A, skinny, focused. And then there are the critics who will tell you the social scene. And there tend to be. Correct me if I'm wrong, there aren't many who can do both.
Well,
not many who can do both.
Sam Sifton decided, I am a New York reporter, and I'm going to talk about the social scene and the social context.
That's what he decided.
And that was just this very deliberate decision. So
sure.
That's what you got when you read his reviews.
Right.
It was as if it was about New York.
It was as if Anton Ego was suddenly singing whatever. Things from CBGB. So it's sort of disorienting. But
It's social scene. But when you say the endless maw of the web, which is the great white shark.
So anyway,
for
I
all
got
of
into
us.
that by listicles, as I call them, are stuff that is on the web, and the stuff that's on the web is always being consumed in a different way. Every year it's consumed differently. Now it's all mobile. So if you have a listicle, thing to list, you can list it. It's all designed to be digested very quickly and looked at very quickly. And the judgment's made very quickly, and then they're on. They're like grasshoppers. They're not even grasshoppers. They're bionic mayflies. I don't know what they are. They started out as grasshoppers.
But do you feel that that people, following on your earlier points, really only want information and they're not interested in your judgment? So where is the role of judgment now?
I think they are interested in your judgment to a certain extent. And I think if you've been around and the knowledgeable eaters, a lot of it depends on the city where you are. I mean, I happen to think that because it's such chaos, I happen to think that a critic is very valuable. And I think the more full-time critics that are out there, the better. And I also think that the voice, the sort of the voice of the old wise critic, and this would not just be in food, but in everything, is something that I find helpful as a consumer. I mean, as a critic, I'm really ultimately writing for the consumer. So I find it helpful. I think it's a way that we can ideally guide people through the chaos.
It is definitely a consumer service. It's a guide. It's also trying to channel people and lead them to a place you think they need to see and witness. Mm-hmm. So I view my highest calling, the thing I most like doing, is being able to make a restaurant I don't think is going to have a chance otherwise succeed by bringing them business. That's the thing I like doing best. I can't do it all the time because then I would just be a namby-pamby critic who's always saying nice things. So you have to take people down.
And well, that's the other. There's a whole art. You have to do all sorts of different things. In this day and age, when everybody knows everything, and you have food blogs, they're not blogs anymore. What do we call them? Sites. It's very hard. Certainly in a place like New York, it's very hard to find something that's new. Certainly I tend to write the upscale reviews. Very good two writers, Rob Patchernite and Rob Racefield, have for years written the cheap eats stuff in New York, and they will ferret out places. The thing about when you're writing from more down market, underground gourmet, they call it in New York, is that you can't really be negative because nobody wants to hear about a negative sandwich joint out in God knows where, because they're not going there, and it is all vicarious. Like they're like laboring to come up with these good places that people haven't heard of because everybody's heard of everything, and B that is like something that's new and different, and good, and so I think it's harder. It's harder. The great master, of course, is Jonathan Gold at the LA Times, who writes high, writes low, and is hooked into everything. And he can, and also LA is a kind of dining culture where you have this vast, sprawling, basically world of I wouldn't call it underground or cheap eats. I wouldn't even call it ethnic eats. We can call it, it's this international world of food, where a guy like Gold can really basically performs a great civic service by finding things and bringing them together and writing about them in this beautiful way.
Well, it's
but
also
that's rare. That's
it's
quite
also
rare.
lucky because it's his taste. So it's not like somebody said you have to find every Korean bao joint. He wants to.
Right.
It's always been what he's wanted to do and what he loves doing. Plus, he's this beautiful
writer.
A beautiful writer.
He's one of these writers who combines knowledge and the scene and ties it all together. I don't know what we're talking about, Jonathan Gold, endlessly. Actually, there's a book. It's a book of his. New York, LA is quite a hard place to grasp. And if you want one of the great books, really about LA and about the sort of Strange Culture of LA is a collection of his columns, which he wrote for the LA Weekly, I think, called Counterculture. You know that?
Yeah, I do know Counterculture.
And it's like, it's just like, most of those places probably closed or whatever, but it's just that you read it and you get a sense of this community through the food, which is really why writing about food is so fascinating. But he's one of the people who does it
And
really
that
well.
is what led me to writing about food. People ask a lot, why do you write about food? And I said, I like the people who make it. I'm interested in the worlds behind food. Yep. And what goes on. So what led you to write about food?
I was a normal writing person. I was a magazine writer for years and years and years. Initially, I was writing a column. One of the things I was doing, I was writing a column for the New York Observer, which is like a diary column. I was also writing endless features for glossy magazines about celebrities and other crazy people. But in this Observer column, I would write about the things that I liked, about my day, my bad, absurd dating life, about, you know, the thing, you know, it was just one of these diary columns. I wrote it twice a month for the New York Observer, called the New Yorker Diary. And a lot of food kept popping up. Right, I would write about. I grew up in Asia, overseas. My father was a diplomat, and I had two brothers, and we grew up sort of voraciously eating our way around Asia. Sort of one of the things that you do if you're sort of the only thing, is that food is the fastest way to identify with wherever you happen to be. Like, you know, and we were in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan, and we were adolescents and kids, and the fastest way for us to identify with those cultures was to go eat the food. So, and we were these giant, you know, bare-headed characters. So we ate a lot. We were running around. And so I grew up doing that. I grew up enjoying food. I didn't cook very much. I wasn't a type A food obsessive. I wasn't even a foodie, but I enjoyed food a lot. Anyway, so in this Observer column, food would pop up, and Gail Green, who was the longtime critic at New York Magazine, you know, a great personage in that world. And that world, I've described it before. When Gail was in that world, it was sort of like the, you know, they were like European counts before World War I. You know, they were walking around with their jewels and their medals and their, you know, speaking in accents. And Gail's whole thing was that she wore hats, and, you know, she had hats and would come into her restaurants in her hat. Of course, she was the only person wearing a hat, so everybody knew that Gail was there. But she was with her hat, you know. So she was this figure. She'd grown up in that world, and she'd announced that she was retiring. And I don't know, maybe you did that job for a while. You did way before. But anyway, Gail, you probably work with Gail. You know about Gail. Anyway.
Well, one doesn't work with Gail.
No, you don't really work. You can have lunch with her, but you're not really talking to her very much.
I alternated with Gail. So
yeah. So you know Gail. Yeah. You know how that works. Yeah. And funny, she summoned me. Anyway, so an editor that I had worked with before. And the magazine was in one of its periods of turmoil, and asked me, would I like to try and be a restaurant critic? And I said, why not? You know, it's a full-time job. So when you're a freelance contract writer for a magazine, you're looking for a full-time job. I said, sure, why not? Why not? And so they offered me the job, I think somewhat to Gail's chagrin, because she'd never heard of me. And so she summoned me to have lunch at the Alain Ducasse restaurant. Alain Ducasse is still is one of the great chefs, possibly the greatest chef in France. And this was at the end of the period. It was right at the year 2000. It's the end of the period that I'm talking about, sort of right before the revolution. And in those days, the great chefs of Europe would come to the States, and they'd arrive in New York, and they'd be treated like by these counts and dukes and, you know, ducal, whatever they were, like arriving popes, right? They'd go and kiss their rings and say how beautiful they were and taste their food, and then they'd report out to the population that we've had this delicious food, and this is good and this is bad, and now you can come. So, and Ducasse's restaurant, which he opened with great fanfare in the back of one of the New York hotels in Midtown. So she summoned me to lunch, and she gave me a false name to ask for. I forgot what it was.
Donna Forrest.
She had a lot of false names. I have false names. It was, I think it was and whatever, some crazy false name. Lunchtime. You couldn't get a reservation at the place anyways. There's no way you can get in. So I arrive, and she's wearing her hat, and sitting in the little alcove, a champagne alcove, where you like sip champagne. There she is. And I address her by her false name. She goes, it's call me Gail. Let's go sit down. So we went and sat down in this empty dining room, and immediately DeGosse comes out and says, hi. Hi, what's up? How you doing? Hi, Gail. So this whole kabuki, and I'm just like, who are these people? This is like what is this job going to entail? And then Gail, to her credit, panned the place. She wrote one of her best, she's a great critic, actually. Gail's a very feisty writer. He's one of the first critics who actually would treat restaurants, certainly in New York, as a cultural happening. And so she is one of her last great pieces. She panned DeGosse, and then everybody else panned DeGosse, and that was the end of DeGosse in New York. And actually beginning of the end of fine dining, pretty much. Anyway, so that's how I got the job. And it is turned into much more than a restaurant's critic job. Food is now much more than what, it used to be sort of pigeonholed, and now it's something that encompasses the environment, travel, this generation that I've talked about, the Starbucks generation, their Pied Piper is Tony Bourdain. I mean, food is a giant canvas now, and so it's I was quite surprised. I was like, my thought was like, I'm going to be in these restaurants, I might eat myself to death, I might die, everybody's weird. But it turned out to be a way into this, really a very interesting, fascinating, tactile, very enjoyable way into the culture, certainly in New York and really into the world.
What do you do? So when you were talking about video, you famously came out and picture of yourself on the cover of New York Magazine, and
well, that wasn't my idea, by the way. That's right. The editor's idea.
So
it was Adam Moss's idea.
And why?
This is not. I guess this is public, but whatever. I don't know. We want to do something different. Adam Moss is the editor of New York Magazine. New York Magazine. Adam Moss is Corby, probably the great magazine editor of his generation, to the extent that there are any anymore. Very inventive, very savvy. And the thing about these city magazines is that, like you were saying, they're service publications. And the great trick is to try and make them something more than that. And Moss is in a constant struggle, and I think he's succeeded in doing that, in making it something more than just where do I go eat my pizza, where do I buy some
He steals the politics writers we at the Atlantic want, and he gets them.
Well, yeah, vice versa. Now everybody steals you can see what everybody's doing, and You talking about Sullivan?
I am.
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't steal.
He didn't steal, but whatever.
He got him and we didn't.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, so it was Moss is like, I think he got tired of one of the horrible things that you have to do as a magazine critic, I'm sure you've done many of them, is these year-end wrap-ups of like the top 100, it's so patently a service package, and it takes a lot of time to do, and it's actually hard to do well, and it's the same year after year, and I think he grew weary of that, and we'd been talking about it. It's like, he would come out to have dinner with me, and he would see this absurd kabuki thing, the thing that I talked to about Gail, but which, in a place like New York, the stakes are so high, the rents are high, they're paying a lot of money to do what they're doing, and so it's their business to find out, to see who you are. Like they're in New York, they hire PR people who put your picture on the wall. They have spotters. I mean, you know all this, but they have at the big restaurants. They'll have spotters at the bar and other tables, looking for you. And with somebody like me, who's 10 feet tall and bald head, looks like a giant bear, I'm not hard to spot. And Moss would go, "Do they know who you are?" I go, "Well, of course they know who I am." And they would. The thing I wrote when I came out, quote unquote. Not only do they know who you are, they'll often put you in a part of the room where they can hear better. They can hear, and people would say, like, don't you know they can hear everything you're saying, and they're all back there hearing you. And they also will know your tastes. And Danny Meyer, it's a great restaurateur, Danny Meyer, his children were in the same school as mine. And he told me once that when I would come in, they'd have, because they knew I liked pork and heavy food, and they would call it platnip. So they'd do a plate of platnip for Platt's here. So lay on the beefy, fatty, crunchy, lardy. So give them some platnip. So like there are all these ways that they seduce you. And so anyway, Moss, because he's smart, thought it was all ridiculous. And by the way, ideally you should be anonymous. I think you'd agree with me on that. You should be anonymous. You should be this ghost-like figure who comes in and out and goes to the restaurant
My
100
friend Barbara
times.
Kafka, when I started the New York job, said, it's always worse when you're recognized. And that is so true.
It's true. You should be anonymous.
The timing is thrown off.
They go nuts.
They send out dishes you don't want, and you carefully construct an order because there are things you feel you need to have, and then they'll send you stuff you don't want, and they'll halt everything for a long time.
Oh yeah, people come out with me and they go,
do it.
yeah, they're like, you know that this is very slow, right? You'll know that we've been sitting here now for 45 minutes and there's no food. You know that's because of you. You go, oh, really? Okay.
It happened.
You get used to it.
It happened to me a week ago at a new restaurant in Boston, and I said to them afterward, it was really a long wait between courses. I actually said to them because they had said hello to me.
Well, you
when
were
I
in
came
disguise too, so you were shocked.
I was not in disguise.
Okay,
I was
joke.
recognized,
It was a joke.
and that's the thing about that cover, which struck me as extremely sensible. Plus, you wrote about it so elegantly and wittily, about everyone pretending they don't know you. You know they know you. It is ridiculous.
Right. And it's not just me, by the way. It's whoever.
Although in Boston, one of the great things is I will often go to restaurants where I do know the owner, and there will be, or they've met me, and there will be a staff on that is new. Mm-hmm. They don't know me. There's like lots of glitches, and I think, great. Mm-hmm. You know, I get to have an actual civilian meal. That's probably the exception now. But the real exception is paid restaurant critics, because I think there's so few.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, that's what it's a dinosaur's profession, really. I mean, I wish it weren't. And the websites that do a lot to fund, Eater, which is the sort of dominant food website, they have 3 critics full time, I think, out of New York. Mm-hmm. But they also get a lot of venture capitalist money. So I hope it continues, because I think you need that sort of. The only way that you are going to be the only way you're going to get the sort of the voice of the unattached, non-co-opted voice is if you pay for your own food. That's really the only way you're going to do it.
That is the bottom line.
That's the bottom line. And once you start paying, and once you start, I mean, you're dependent, and then you just become cheerleaders. And so that's it. I mean, you need a expense account, and if you don't have it, you will become just grateful to be fed, and just prattle on about how happy you were to be fed, and how wonderful the pork chop is, and so and so's a genius, and blah blah blah.
So what's the process for? In about 3 minutes, we're going to open to questions. So think of some questions. What's the process for determining where you review? And who decides it? Are you constantly on the lookout for new places? And you get to go to restaurants that you don't review. I have almost no budget to do that.
Really?
At both magazines.
Well, I'm more and more constrained that way. In New York, I think it's different from other places. I mean, New York, even today, when you have this sort of tyranny of the two-star experience, if we're going to go by the Times star system, which I think is excellent. Pete Wells, God bless him, will write a few 3-star reviews, but they tend to be about the kind of things that in the olden days would not be considered worthy of any kind of 3
Sure.
stars. I can't remember, but maybe you can remember. They're like pasta places in Brooklyn, and the 4-star reviews are few and far between. because for the reasons that I've been talking about. A lot of the systems in the olden days, not even so olden days, and this is quite true of Michelin, is that in critics, we can talk about the star system for days. We hate the star system. I hate the star system. The time systems, it's become more of a designation of the kind of restaurant. It had become that, the kind of restaurant. Like a 4-star restaurant would be one where the entrees cost over $40 and blah, blah, blah. And, it was a certain experience that you were gonna have. Now, the critic has to rethink it and try and again, he's trying to sell his view, and I think Wells does a fabulous job with this, but he's trying to rejigger the system in these very shifting waters. And so, why was I talking about the star system? How did I get on?
Well, everybody hates the star system,
Yeah,
but we were talking about how few paid critics there are, impartiality, necessity of criticizing.
Yeah.
I think it's on its way out.
Yes.
I hate the star system, but I was asking how you choose restaurants.
Okay.
Who chooses
So
them for you?
okay. You choose them the way you always did. I mean, there still are restaurants that open, which the critics, because whether the chef is high profile, they really sort of come along like plays. If not Broadway shows, then semi-off-Broadway shows, and all the critics go to them. And that's my case. I very rarely will ferret out or be able to find a place that's new. I recently reviewed a small restaurant, a small bistro right near my office, a place called Mimi, and it was about a year old, and I was like, people kept telling me, you gotta go to this place. Times didn't review it, nobody reviewed it. And I went, I was like, my God, what's this place doing here? Why didn't we know about it? And I gave a good review. So I don't know if I discovered Mimi, but for some reason the buzz machine didn't get hold of it. And so that happens once in a while, but it's very rare. Usually there's a sort of a procession. Things get hyped on the web, and then they slowly work their way up to somebody like me. And it still works that way. And we're probably the same. I'd like to have a place open at least 6 weeks. At least 6 weeks before I review it.
It used to be 3 months. It's now 2 months that you start, and then you hope that you get to review them sometime into the 3rd month.
Right. Although when I was reviewing more, like I used to do like 45 reviews a year. I'd say after a month, I'm going. Because I needed to find places to review. And now I have a little more time, and so it's 6. It can go on forever now, but it's probably about 6 weeks. 6 weeks, 7 weeks.
Wow, 45 is a lot. Yikes.
It's a lot. Well, the Times, like, the Times, I mean, God bless them. I think P. Wells does a fabulous job. It's very hard to find places to write about. And when you do choose a place, you have to do what I say. You have to make your argument. It's not that it's like, oh, here I am.
That's what makes these reviews hard. You have to write an essay.
It's hard. Like, it's not easy. It's like, and you can't, it's not like you're a book critic and you can maunder on about your prior knowledge of the writer or whatever the hell you're talking about.
But
like
you have to find a point you want to make,
right.
Then figure out the opening,
right.
Then the middle where you're going to talk about the food, but not too much.
And also, like, by the way, why are you reviewing this place? Like, there's certain kind of places, like I very much follow the motto of whoever it was, maybe Mencken or somebody, but as a journalist, one should, how does it go? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Afflict the comfortable, yeah.
And that's pretty much how I do it. The more high profile, the more overhyped, the more stuffed, shirty, the more I'm inclined to say, screw you. The more it's open. And I'll do it for good reasons.
But it's
usually.
Open season. It's open season on places, especially that are pretentious and overpriced.
Yeah.
Then you feel, okay, I can do whatever I want.
I also sort of like the places, I get so like the big hype machine that I was talking about, like the endless hype machine. And places get hyped and they hype. There's a restaurant called Carbone, which we were talking about. Carbone is endlessly hyped and sort of good, a neo red sauce, circus restaurant down in the village with the, veal chops selling for $55 and, braying waiters and pasta fajoule or whatever. people were like, well, you've been there a lot, just going insane. And I was like, no, sorry, I don't like that. And I gave them a bad review, and they went mad, and they kicked me out of their next restaurant. So that was fun too. You ever been kicked out of a restaurant?
Never, no.
It's
I've
awesome.
been threatened.
So awesome.
You were escorted out?
Oh yeah, you're leaving. Did you hear that story?
Yes,
the whole
yes.
thing. It was like a whole and you're like, there's a small restaurant called ZZ's Clam Bar, which is down the street from Carbone. And these guys are really good chefs though, but anyway, whatever. And so I'm sitting there with my editor, an editor friend of mine, who's used to being treated very well he edits very fancy food books, and he's like, oh, here we are at ZZ's, I'm with this critic, I'm having a great time. And I think their restaurants, I think Jay-Z is an investor or somebody like that. So ZZ's has a bouncer in front of it and a felt rope, which they set up, just a random felt rope. Even though it's a very small place, one of these tasting places, very small drinks, set menu. And not suddenly, we'd been having a nice time, and the bouncer, who's just doing his job, appears, this giant guy, and he goes, you're done here. And I go, excuse me? I go, well, you're done here. And then my editor friend gets red in the face. He goes, well, what do you mean? I go, we're done here. And then I tell him, I said, well, okay, I'd like to pay for the meal. He goes, you're done here. I said it 5 times. I'd like to pay for the meal. You're done here. You're done here. And I said, okay, we're done here. And I took a picture of my whatever overpriced thing I was eating, and went out on the sidewalk and immediately tweeted it and wrote about it, and all hell broke loose. And it was really quite.
That is
quite
really
enjoyable. It was really quite enjoyable.
Really fun.
Yeah.
I've been told 3 ways to start questions, and we've only got 2 minutes. So, questions. Are there any questions? We have 2. The woman right here, and then the gentleman in the green shirt right behind her.
So you mentioned the Starbucks generation.
Right.
What's your future, given that the Starbucks generation goes to Yelp and TripAdvisor for all their restaurant information?
Well, my future is that I'm the only one who knows what the hell's going on out there. So as long as I'm around, they should pay attention to me. That's in my own head. My real future is I'm a dinosaur. And if and when I drop dead of a cataclysmic food-induced event, or I retire, I mean, New York Magazine, Adam Moss, we're talking about it, he's very conscious that New York Magazine, while the web and their website has a national, even international footprint, that the magazine retains this sense of New Yorkiness, in the sense that it's a part of a city. And obviously dining is very important to New York. So he wants to have, thank God, a real restaurant critic. He thinks it's very important for the brand and the feel of the publication. Now, should he leave, or should he? The economics of it are tough. The reviews. I don't know if this is true of you guys, but the reviews when I started writing, the reviews on the website were like top every week. People like huge, whatever, clicks, play. Now they're buried. Nobody reads them. People are much more, the listicles and the openings get much more play than the review will get play for a couple of days, a day or so, a couple of days, then it'll fade away. And certainly and this is true of food in general, weirdly. It's tended to stay very local. People are obsessed with it, but like the restaurant scenes are very local, and they're like very intense, but very local city to city. Whereas a discussion of the last episode of Game of Thrones on New York Magazine's website will get endless play. So the food really can't compete with it, and the reviews really can't compete with the movie reviews and the stuff where it's all about it's all about starting conversations. And so you have the local conversations about the restaurant, but on the website, on the New York website, which is, like I said, a national, the big conversations are about politics, about Game of Thrones, about that stuff, and the food can't compete with it.
True. Well said.
So I might be doomed. I don't know.
Are all your meals at 5:30 or 9 p.m.?
Pretty much. They're actually 5:30, 6, with my lovely daughter there. A lot of it's because well, you know this, because it's easier to get a table. You know, it's easier to get a table, and I now have gotten so used to it that I will show up. I'll make a 5:30 reservation. I'll show up at 6:30. A lot of times. Again, it depends on the restaurant. You know, it depends on how there's a restaurant now. There's a big restaurant in New York that's opening. Everybody, you know, that's the thing. The food community, they all go there before the critics write about it. But yeah, 5:30 and 10 o'clock. I don't know. Do you like 10 o'clock?
I've done it a lot.
Forget it.
But it's very annoying. And my spouse goes to bed early, so it's tough.
If you're doing it under a phony name, which they know actually, but if you're doing it under a phony name, you're cooked. Yeah, you're cooked.
I always have 1,000 different names because I put the name of the guest.
Yeah.
I just put my guest name.
I will have guests make reservations. Sometimes I will go with prominent people who will get in, and the prominent people will then walk in with me, and they'll be frowned at. You know, but sometimes that happens. I have less deadline pressure now than I used to. You had this deadline pressure, so you have to get in, you have to do the plays, and like you have to do it. Now, because I'm write, say 20 reviews a year, 25 is less. I like it better actually, obviously, but you know, it's less pressure.
I would like it better too. I used to take the mayor of Boston because
that's good.
He
Mayor
was
Boston's
my
good.
spouse's boss, and it really took all the attention off me. It was great. So we have to wrap up. This has been great, and you can come and ask Adam your question, and I'm glad you all came, and
Thank you, everybody.
Especially delighted that Adam came.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much for coming.